Good afternoon and welcome to today's webinar. This is Amanda Carhughes. I'm the Director of Advocacy at NASSP, and I will be your moderator for today's webinar. This is the first webinar in our three-part webinar series on the Every Student Succeeds Act, which is the latest version of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act. And today we will focus on the Title I provisions. If you have any technical problems during the broadcast, please call the GoToWebinar attendee support at 855-352-9002 and provide today's webinar ID that you see on the screen. That is 142-913-755. We also encourage you to participate in this webinar and expand the conversation on Twitter using the hashtag NASSP webinar. We're also on Facebook at facebook.com/principals. And I should note, we've already had one question, that today's webinar is being recorded and will be available on the NASSP website within 24 hours at nassp.org/webinar videos. I'm pleased to be joined today by David Chodak, who's our Associate Director of Advocacy, and our guest speaker, Richard Long, who's the Executive Director of the Learning First Alliance. During the webinar today, we do invite you to send your questions to us. We ask that you please submit them using the question box on your GoToWebinar panel, and we'll respond to as many questions as time permits at the end of the presentation. If we do run out of time to answer all of these questions, we're going to provide our Twitter handles at the end of the presentation for you to send us your questions that way as well. So we're going to start off by talking about what we know and what it means in your school about ESSA, the new law to replace No Child Left Behind. Just to give you a brief history of ESEA, this is the Elementary and Secondary Education Act that was first passed in 1965. Every version of ESEA does have a new name, and the most recent version was the No Child Left Behind Act, which was passed back in 2001. Congress typically reauthorizes major laws such as this every 5 to 6 years. So I think we have a pretty bright audience that knows that if you had done the math, ESEA was very overdue for reauthorization. Had it passed in 2007 as scheduled, we would have been talking about the next reauthorization of the ESEA. But the version that was passed in December 2015 is called the Every Student Succeeds Act, or ESSA, and it was a bipartisan bill created by Senators Lamar Alexander and Patty Murray. And it will completely replace the No Child Left Behind Act and the ESEA flexibility waivers. Very quickly, we're going to go through the structure of ESEA. There are 9 titles in total, but during our webinar series, we're going to focus today on Title I, Improving Basic Programs Operated by the State and Local Educational Agencies. The next webinar in April will focus on Title II, Preparing, Training, and Recruiting Teachers, Principals, or Other School Leaders. And in the third webinar, we'll focus on Title IV, 21st Century Schools. And this is a new block grant that was created by Congress and consolidated over 50 programs, that the purpose was to provide districts funding for education technology, a well-rounded education, and improve school conditions for student learning.
So now we're going to go ahead and talk about the implementation timeline for ESSA. As Amanda said, President Obama signed ESSA into law in December of 2015. After that happened, the Department of Education issued a request for information for Title I and received over 369 responses on issues related to assessments, supplement not supplant, and other issues within Title I. NASSP and NAESP, the National Association of Elementary School Principals, submitted comments on the RFI and drafted a letter with the American Federation of School Administrators on our Title II recommendations as well. The ESEA flexibility waivers will expire in August 1st of 2016, and the Department of Education also issued a letter to chief state school officers in January explaining that schools in non-waiver states would need to continue to implement interventions in schools identified in need of improvement, corrective action, or restructuring, but they would not be required to provide supplemental education services or school choice. NASSP will be closely following the regulatory and guidance process this spring and summer, and we expect the department to issue final guidance and regulations in October of 2016, which will then determine state deadlines for developing new Title I plans. It is also worth noting that the Negotiated Rulemaking Committee has already started meeting. Their first session was March 21st through March 23rd, being today. The second session will be April 6th through April 8th. And if they still have issues to resolve, they will be meeting for a third time on April 18th and 19th to discuss supplement, not supplant, and assessments. And lastly, the full implementation of ESSA will begin in the 2017-2018 school year. So now we're going to go ahead and discuss college and career ready standards in ESSA. Under ESSA, the Secretary of Education cannot influence, incentivize, or coerce states to adopt the Common Core state standards or other academic standards common to a significant number of states. Additionally, the Secretary cannot provide funds to develop, incentivize, pilot test, or implement any federally sponsored national test that is aligned with the Common Core state standards or other standards common to a significant number of states. The law also ensures states have every right to withdraw from or make modifications to the Common Core state standards or other standards that they have chosen to adopt. States do have to implement challenging academic standards that must include not less than 3 levels of achievement to be used by the state, LEAs, and schools. These standards do have to be aligned with entrance requirements for the public system of higher education within the state and career and technical education standards within the state. In ESSA, states are required to conduct annual assessments in math and reading in grades 3 through 8 and once in high school. States are also required to conduct assessments in science once in grades 3 through 5, 6 through 8, and 9 through 12. States could select a national assessment such as the SAT or ACC to fulfill the high school assessment requirements. And this is one of the topics that is currently being discussed at the negotiated rule-making meetings. Schools are required to have a 95% participation rates in assessments, but states will determine the penalties for not meeting that goal. And this will definitely be something to monitor as certain states have continued to have rising opt-out testing participation rates. ESSA also provides a competitive grant for states to audit their state and local assessments to determine where there is duplicity and hopefully reduce the number of tests given each year. And lastly, up to 7 states can apply for the Innovative Assessment and Accountability Demonstration Project, and several states throughout the country have already indicated their interest to do so.
So good news for educators is that we have a new accountability system in ESSA. It completely eliminates adequate yearly progress, or AYP, and the 100% proficiency goal. Instead, states are going to be required to design their own accountability plans that include ambitious goals and expectations for all student subgroups. And we see this as one of the many opportunities where educators can get involved in advocacy at the state and local level to help their states develop those accountability systems. Now, the law does have minimum requirements for what must be included in those mandatory performance goals. It must include academic achievement on assessments, high school graduation rates, and progress in achieving English language proficiency, which is something new that was not included in most accountability systems previously. States must also include an additional indicator that could include student engagement, educator engagement, student access to and completion of advanced coursework, post-secondary readiness, or school climate and safety. And again, we think this is a real opportunity for advocacy for principals and other educators who could be providing recommendations to their states about that additional indicator and what a meaningful accountability system that actually supports schools should encompass. So just to talk a little bit about funding levels under Title I, in FY 2016, Title I was funded at $14.9 billion. These dollars are actually forward funded, which means that this is the funding that schools will have for the 2016-2017 school year. ESSA has authorization levels for only 4 years, which is very telling that it means Congress thinks that it may actually reauthorize a bill sooner than it did the last time. But it would authorize $15 billion for 2017 and then have incremental increases up to fiscal year 2020. It should be noted that the President's budget request for FY 2017 called for $15.4 billion. And while this may appear to be a $450 million increase, this really is a freeze at the combined FY 2016 level for Title I and the School Improvement Grants Program. And this was a program that was completely removed from ESSA, but we'll talk about that in a few more minutes. NASSP is very passionate about formula funding for these key programs, and we did join with the school superintendent, the teachers unions, our principal colleagues at NAESP, and the National School Boards Association to urge House and Senate appropriators to fund Title I at $450 million above the President's proposed request.
Hello, everyone. My name is Rich Long. I'm with the Learning First Alliance. I want to thank NASSP for inviting me to participate in today's webinar and hope that some of the observations I have to share with you are useful. First off, there are several, a lot of people look at the new statute as being essentially a modification of No Child Left Behind. In many ways, that's true, but some of these modifications bring forth some really interesting changes. And one of the changes is in how districts would be rank ordering their schools to then determine which buildings get Title I funds and not. Because the basic problem is that we only serve about 20, 25% or 30% of the eligible students in Title I. This means that there are a lot of buildings and frankly, a lot of kids who aren't getting services that way. To take care of what was really a structural issue, and that was that it was based on percentages and not simply on raw numbers, and this was frankly to protect one population versus another, that in the new statute, more Title I dollars are most likely going to be flowing to high schools. And so this means that in the past, many secondary school principals and federal program officers would be not paying attention to what was going on in the high school level by where the structure is, how the accounting actually works, and how the plans that they had would relate to working in this modality. Here, though, if you become a Title I high school, the slide says here, you must use a school-wide program. Well, the alternative is that you would become what was called target assistants, and elementary schools certainly have still retain that option. School-wide, it allows Title I money to touch all of the students if you so desire it to go that way. So it means that, for example, if your art program is something that's really unique and you see it making a difference for disadvantaged students, you could actually work it that way so that you have a lot more flexibility in that regard. But more importantly, and perhaps more significantly, in programs like multi-tiered systems of support, there is not a really contortion of issues that you have to deal with to use Title I fundings with local funds and with state funds in order to do something that you're actually providing for every student in your building. The other thing is that the feds are requiring that funds, well, not requiring, but they could be used for programs where there's concurrent enrollment between colleges and the high schools. And part of the reason for that, of course, is that more and more people are understanding Title I not in terms of being purely a remedial program. In the 1964, 68, and 72 amendments, the word remedial was kind of beat into the program. But since that time, there's been a slow moving away to understand that to help all children who have high needs, it's not to limit them purely to a remedial approach, but to invite approaches that really open up their vista and use motivation. so with that, there is new flexibilities here that are sometimes simply in the nuance, and here's an important change in where that's going. Now, where are we right now? This is really an interesting question. As David mentioned, negotiated rulemaking is concluding today in the first iteration. Earlier in the week, members of the department and the Hill were at a meeting with a major national group talking about where they were and how they were interpreting much of what I'm about to be talking to you about. What is abundantly clear is that the people who wrote the statute and the people who interpreted the statute seem to be on slightly different pages in some of these key concepts. Now, part of the reason for that is that, as much as Amanda mentioned, this is the 9th rewrite of ESEA, but many of the provisions from this first, second, and third rewrite of ESEA are still there. So we have some artifacts that are still there, that even though there are encouragements for changes and encouragement for thinking in some new and dynamic ways in Title I, there still are some requirements that have to be either adjudicated somehow through the regulatory process or through congressional action, or that they do then make it more difficult for somebody to say categorically A or B when it comes to how Title I is being interpreted. Now, I'm going to talk to you also about, in negotiated rulemaking, what is it? Well, it is an opportunity. They're called stakeholders, and we're going to use that term again throughout this webinar, of professionals from different parts of the education community to get around and try to work out some of the more difficult and nuance-rich issues that are here. And we're going to talk a little bit about supplement, not supplant, high school assessments, and 8th grade math. Now, in terms of supplement, not supplant, the easy way to understand this is that when Title I was first written, the statute said, we understand that school districts need additional resources in order to bring kids up to a basic level of education. And basic at this time was not the NAEP definition, but rather, essentially remedial program. And in fact, the statute says that they thought that the federal government should be providing as much as 40% additional resources on top of state and local resources in order to make that difference. In other words, to make sure that a kid in the poorest parts of the country had the same access to, at that time, just reading instruction in order for them to enjoy the benefits of our and contribute to our society. So it's in addition to. So if somebody says, what is supplement, not supplant, it means that federal dollars are in addition to, not instead of. Now, I mentioned earlier about the high school programs now being brought in under the new procedures for deciding what schools are in. The functional impact, though, is that those buildings will be school-wide. Many districts have decided to concentrate resources using targeted assistance. And this is, and all of this then impacts how supplement, not supplant. So how do you score keep what's in addition to and what's instead of? And so negotiated rulemaking, all the stakeholder representatives getting around a metaphorical table are trying to determine how to have a supplement, not supplant, that maintains the idea that we're concentrating resources on our most vulnerable children who are living in poverty, and at the same time give the flexibility to the school leaders who want to concentrate and use resources in creative and expected to be very effective ways. So in the long term, there's an issue then how to concentrate the resources to make a difference, but how to do it in such a way that maintains the integrity of the program. Maintenance of effort is another one of these concepts related to Title I and how dollars are done. The idea here is to say not just within the year what money is being spent, but from year to year. Now, I must tell you that over the last 20 years, 30 years, in fact, there's been some national reports that have said that because maintenance of effort allows shifting of dollars on a year-to-year basis, that there's been a lack of concentration of using Title I dollars because they've been replacing state and local dollars. Now here in the green, you'll see it says falling below 90%. That's the current number. So a district may move 90% of its money, or has to keep 90% of its money rather, in the program from one year to the next, which means 9.9% could be moved. And if you do that over a bunch of years, you can see why some reports are indicating that there's a problem with maintenance of effort, maintaining the purpose of the program on helping high needs children. Now, comparability is another one of these similar issues. That how do you actually measure what is a effort being done? Well, somebody might say, well, let's use just dollars. Well, if you use just dollars, it actually it changes from places across the country. It also doesn't take into account local needs and concerns. But part of the problem is, of course, that what's happened with comparability in trying to maintain that it's the service being provided is how to maintain how the quality of services is being done. So we do have this as an issue, and salary differences between teachers are specifically excluded, and that's frankly there to give some flexibility without hopefully destroying the program. And it is one of those very touchy issues between the civil rights communities and others. Now, in high school assessments, a national there's something very unique here, and this is essentially a new discretion given to high schools to make a decision about how they want to fulfill the high school requirement. And here, with the permission of the state, or probably what will happen is it will be the state agency will put out some sort of list or some sort of criteria that must have been reflected, and it will be done through a reporting requirement, meet the U.S. Department of Ed's peer review criteria. Now, as was mentioned earlier, the U.S. Department of Education has less power to say specifically what they want to have happen. In the peer review process, U.S. Department of Education may say if they don't like something, but they can't actually say what would be the quote, the answer to replace this. So even in here, we see how the design of the new statute is playing out in decision making, with the idea that local professionals will have the ability to make the decisions what's in the best interest of their students. Now, there is a difference also, though, and we're seeing this in some interesting discussions coming here in D.C. about what's an effective the benchmark. If you remember, 20 years ago, everyone was saying, the kids who take Algebra 1 by the 8th grade are doing better just by definition. Well, of course, that was because of a lot of environmental issues. Well, now what's saying is that, okay, if the 8th grader is taking a math assessment that's the equivalent of the exam, then that indeed can stand in its place. But it's also designed to give an awareness that we want to push kids, and we want to be including kids who have significant abilities in all these programs, so they can be pushed ahead and be encouraged to be pushed ahead, rather than continuing to have to take tests that, if you're doing very well, and I can say this as I committed parenthood several years ago, and my kids would be taking the higher end of the mathematics program, and in the Commonwealth of Virginia at that time, they required then for them to take the the SOL test, the Standards of Learning test. And in doing so, it also, though, encouraged the kids not to pay attention as much. So you had an awareness of both higher end abilities and higher end encouragements and giving flexibility to the locals, at the same time as burgeoning awareness of how motivation takes part in all this stuff. And frankly, you'll see this all throughout the statute. There's a lot of indications of an awareness of social, emotional learning activities and procedures that can be done, and encouragements are there to be using Title I dollars. Now, the consultative process. This is one of my favorite parts of the new statute. And that's because here, unlike in the past, we would see the Congress and the Department of Ed set up a process of advisory boards and this and that of experts and bringing people in at different levels. Well, here, there's almost a new type of what I consider political science being brought to bear here. And that is that both at the national level and at the state level, and indeed at the local level and building level, that there is repeatedly, say, stakeholders. Now, who are stakeholders? Well, they're everybody, essentially, who has involvement in the education decision-making, from the parent all the way up to the governor, that there should be a process of which big ideas and procedures are being talked about across the board as to how things are going to be done. What the statute doesn't tell you, and the Department of Ed has not indicated whether or not they're going to give guidance on this, is what is this consultative process? And both Amanda and David are going to be talking to you and have indicated where they say advocacy opportunity is that here are places where you collectively can make your voices heard, both in terms of saying the content you need to say, but also in making recommendations on how that should be done. Because, it could be that the consultative process is a group email. We all know, in all honesty, we know that the state education agencies are not fully populated with professionals. There are far fewer people working there now than there have ever been before. So it isn't like they're sitting around saying, gee, wouldn't it be nice to get a group of people together and talk about these things? They're working night and day as well as you are. And so how this is being done and what is being done is an opportunity for you to make a difference.
ESSA eliminates the School Improvement Grants Program and the SIG turnaround models that required the principal to be replaced, and that was something that NASSP was very supportive of. Beginning with the 2017-2018 school year, states will establish a category of schools for comprehensive support and improvement, which will be identified once every 3 years. And states will be expected to reserve 7% of their Title I funds for school improvement activities. At a minimum, that category will include the lowest performing 5% of all Title I schools, all high schools with graduation rates below 67%, and schools with low subgroup performance. Districts must develop a comprehensive support and improvement plan for the schools to improve student outcomes. In this plan, these plans must be informed by all of the school performance measures in the statewide accountability plan, include evidence-based interventions, be based on school-level needs assessments, identify resource inequities, which may include a review of LEA and school-level budgeting to be addressed through the implementation of such comprehensive support and improvement plans. This plan must also be approved by the school, the LEA, and the state, and upon approval and implementation, must be monitored periodically by the state. So now we're going to go ahead and talk about some of NASSP's advocacy efforts throughout ESSA implementation. NASSP launched a campaign in December 2015 titled Making ESSA Work for You, with the goal of empowering principals to be influencers in the implementation of ESSA. The campaign is driven by several top-line goals, which are to empower principals to make their voices heard at the federal, state, and local level, to raise NASSP's profile as the leader in ESSA conversations, and as a catalyst for principal engagement to influence policy, particularly on selection of school performance measures for state accountability plans, allowable uses of funding under Title II, principal evaluation systems, and resources for implementation, comprehensive literacy, or digital learning initiatives. NASSP had long advocated for a new law to replace NCLB. We had formed a task force of practicing principals and assistant principals that drafted recommendations in 2005 on how to improve the law for the nation's middle level and high school principals. NASSP had members of the board testify at congressional hearings in 2007 and 2015. During this process, we also worked closely with NAESP and AFSA to speak in a unified voice on behalf of the nation's principals. Our organization sent multiple letters to key House and Senate education leaders throughout the reauthorization process, including a final letter in support of the bill. Lastly, we collectively activated our Grassroots network to encourage the passage of ESSA, and more than 3,000 messages were sent to House and Senate leaders.
The Learning First Alliance
The Learning First Alliance is a partnership of leading education organizations representing more than 10 million members dedicated to improving student learning in America's public schools. We share examples of success and encourage collaboration at every level and work toward the continual and long-term improvement of public education based on solid research. And some of the questions guiding this work are, what are community-wide issues on implementation, and what will be community-wide issues in the near future?
So as part of our ESSA Works for You campaign, we've identified those areas where we feel that principals have the most influence in the law, although as Rich mentioned with the consultative process, there are other areas as well. So the first is around the school performance measures that we talked about earlier in this presentation and are focused in Title I. Those are the accountability measures where states have some flexibility on how they can choose and what the overall system will look like. We also feel that there's the ability to influence principal evaluation systems. We'll talk about this a little bit more in our Title II webinar, but essentially the new law does not require states to have a principal evaluation system and doesn't require that student test scores be linked to the evaluation system. So there's a lot of flexibility here if educators want to change the system currently in place in their state. Also during our second webinar, we're going to talk a lot about Title II funding and new flexibility for states to use that funding for school leadership activities. And finally, in our third webinar, we're going to talk about the new resources for literacy and for digital learning that principals and other educators can access. We've also identified some ways that principals can make their voice heard, and this is information that we'll be pushing out to NASSP members throughout the entire term of the implementation and identify ways that you can be more involved. But we certainly would urge you to contact your state Department of Ed, your state legislatures, especially if you have any feelings on those 4 areas that I just identified. If you haven't done so already, we really urge you to connect with your state principals association since they are responsible for doing the advocacy work at the state level. We would encourage you, if you don't already have one, to build a coalition with teachers and parents to advocate on behalf of your school at both the state and the local level, and to make yourself a resource to your superintendent and school board members. Don't just contact them when you need something, but offer yourself as a resource, invite them into your school, and make them understand how ESSA is working for you.
If I could just jump in on that. One of the most successful Title I advocacy I've ever saw was actually in Western Virginia. And Western Virginia is somewhat rural, and so it's not a big urban center. And this was at a time when funding was going to be cut. And this teacher brought forth students that she had earlier to meet with her current second graders. And it was the band, the head of the band leaders, majorette, a cheerleader, and a head football player. Now, as they spoke about how important Title I was to them in learning, in the back of the room were members of the school board, members of the local town council, PTA people, and everybody else. And so at the end of this celebration of the learning of Title I, this teacher turned to these local leaders and said, look, this is really important. You see how it's effective. And if we lose these resources, we're going to come to you for these resources. So don't only think in terms of having the congressional staff walking through your building. Think in terms of how you get everybody to understand how this is a team effort, especially at the high school level, now talking about school-wides. These are resources that are going to help make a difference in your programs that are innovative, your reform-based activities, and in terms of your making a difference with the kids who need the help the most. So keep in mind that you want to create your advocacy in a very rich community tapestry.
Great, Rich. That's really helpful. So NASSP does have another way for you to get more involved in advocacy at the federal level, but it's also an opportunity for you to learn more what's happening at the state level as well, and that's by joining our federal Grassroots network. Some of the benefits is that you do receive a monthly advocacy newsletter from NASSP. You also have an opportunity this year to attend our advocacy conference that will take place June 20th through 22nd and meet with your elected officials here in Washington, D.C. Our goal is to have an FGN member in all 435 congressional districts. So anytime we send an action alert or have any issue arise, we can be sure that every single member of Congress is hearing from a principal or another educator on that issue.
At this time, we were going to go ahead and open up the webinar to questions. We also have provided here both Amanda's, myself, LFA, and Rich Long's email and Twitter handles where appropriate. So I see here that there are already a couple of questions. The first is regarding where the PowerPoint will be available. We are going to go ahead and post the PowerPoint on NASSP's Advocacy ESSA page, and we will be sure to make sure that everyone that was registered in this webinar will also receive additional communications about our two upcoming webinars on Title II in professional development, and that will be taking place on Wednesday, April 27th. And then our third and final webinar, which will take place on Thursday, May 12th, regarding the digital learning and the Title IV block grants programs. I also saw another question here asking to restate the information about the non-waiver state actions, and also available on the NASSP advocacy website is the letter that the Department of Education sent to the chief state school officers. And in that letter, it stated that non-waiver states would need to continue to implement interventions in schools identified in need of improvement, corrective action, or restructuring, but they would not be required to provide supplemental education services or school choice. So I hope that clarifies that question. And at this time, we're also happy to open up the floor and answer any other questions on Title I of ESSA.
I think that also highlights an important issue with the new statute, especially those of you who suffered through the transition period of No Child Left Behind. If you recall, the No Child Left Behind Act was signed into law in early January of 2002. It was passed by the Congress in December of 2001, and it did not change the due dates because the statute was actually anticipated being passed in September of 2001. But if you recall, our nation was attacked, and a whole lot of changes were in place at that time. But because of that, the due dates for various parts of No Child Left Behind literally collided with each other. Some were 45 days after a certain event, some were 30 days before the start of school, and those were not adjudicated by USED. The people on the Hill, frankly, got the message that there had to be a transition phase, and David outlined and Amanda outlined in their various slides about the implementation process. The next year is to give you time to take the new parts of the statute and integrate it with what you've been doing and how you want to go forward. This means that a lot of these new requirements don't kick in right away. Because when you think about things like negotiated rulemaking is part of a very well-defined federal process that results in regulations being processed, which requires them to be drafted, sent out for comment, comments to be reviewed, then the posting of final rulemaking. All of that can take upwards of 180 days. That can be expedited to some degree, but still that would have us into the fall at some point. And again, the Congress was aware that they did not want to create chaos. So they took off some of the issues, all of the issues related to the waiver requirements on August 1, have replaced some of the issues, but the basic idea is what you were doing before related to NCLB per se, without the requirements of things like public schools choice and supplemental education services would be kicked in.
Thank you, Rich. While we're waiting to see if there are any additional questions, I'd like to point out an opportunity. For the first time ever, the National Association of Elementary School Principals and the National Association of Secondary School Principals will be hosting a joint conference from July 9th to the 11th in 2017 in Philadelphia. And for more information, you can go to principalsconference.org.
We did have one more question come in, and that was about the recording for the webinar. Yes, it will be available on the NASSP website within 24 hours, and the address is nassp.org/webinar videos. And again, we'll have that up within the next 24 hours.
So we have a few more minutes left, and we'd again like to encourage anyone that had questions or comments to please go ahead and type them into the questions bar so we can go ahead and address those. And again, if you go ahead and rewatch the webinar and have another question offline, feel free to reach out to any of us. And we went back to the slide that provided our contact information.
I think there's probably one other thing, since we have a little bit of time here. Amanda mentioned this authorization is only the last 4 years. Mm-hmm. And if when you start looking at what happens to schools that aren't making the progress that they're supposed to be making, that 95% level, well, the states are supposed to define what's supposed to be done, but they're supposed to use 3 years of data to do that. Now, if the program is only going to last 4 years, so it's an interesting issue that is going to have to be addressed. Now, does it mean that you should dodge this thing? No. What it means is you got to be aware of what's in play, and just like with No Child Left Behind being extended until the congressional leadership was able to come up with a formula in order to make a political and education policy set of decisions. This is going to be something that is going to be in play as well, and it's going to differ from state to state.
So I see here that there is a question about whether or not the Innovative Assessments and Accountability Demonstration Project will be able to reach beyond 7 states. That's an interesting question because as of right now, it is limited to 7 states, but I do know that there has been a statewide push to possibly increase that number of states participating. And so that's just something that we're going to have to continue to monitor from the Department of Education. But there definitely has been a lot of interest from several states throughout the country that want to go ahead and partake in this innovative assessment pilot.
And the Congress puts pilot programs like this in for exactly the reason what the word pilot means. To some people, it's going to be a compromise, political compromise, but it also gives the opportunity to try out ideas, because some ideas sound really good on paper, some sound really good in a building, but when you try to bring them up to a system-wide level, there tends to be difficulty with the definitions and the communications.
Rich, here's a question for you. Someone is asking, could you say more about how the supplement, not supplant changes will differ in impact depending on whether a school is using targeted assistance or school-wide programming?
Okay. The answer to this is that supplement, not supplant. Let's assume in a targeted assisted building, what you've done is said, we have 100 students and 10 of them are Title I eligible, and we're providing Title I funds. So you would then use that allocation just for those 10 students. In doing so, however, you can't take away any existing funds. And so some schools have said, well, we want to buy iPads for all of our students and your targeted assistance, and that they have enough money to buy it for those 90 kids, and they want to use their federal money to buy it for those 10 kids. Well, that's a violation of supplement, not supplant, in a targeted assisted environment. If you're school-wide, what you are doing is saying that, okay, we are going to buy iPads, especially if it's less than $500, because there is some accounting issues of what's a capital purchase versus non-capital purchase. But we have this going to all the students, and so all the students are eligible. So you're not taking anything away, but you're adding something too. So you're in kind of shorthand, you're not violating supplement, not supplant, using the school-wide model. The U.S. Department of Education has been encouraging buildings to become school-wide because of the technicalities involved. It just makes it easier to be in compliance. A lot of schools have decided to stay with targeted assistance, not because of the compliance issues per se, but indeed because they want to concentrate resources on those specific kids who need very specific help in order to get the reading, math, and now science up to speed.
Great. And I also see another question here just asking for clarification about when ESSA will begin. And you are correct that the full implementation does begin in the 2017-2018 school year. So between now and then is really an opportunity for state and district level advocacy. And throughout our next two webinars, we'll continue to talk about different points where principals and other educators continue to advocate on certain provisions in the law.
We have another question here for Rich. Is there any change in the thresholds to qualify for school-wide expected?
It's an interesting point, because the U.S. Department of Education, well, the statute said buildings with, I think it was 40% of kids who were eligible could switch and become school-wide. And as a point of fact, the Department of Ed was actually encouraging waivers to be applied for even buildings that only had 25% of the kids eligible. So while the thresholds per se haven't changed formally, there is a different procedure to seek waivers. And I believe, and believe is the key word here, that the states are now being allowed to give waivers for that 40%. But all of this will be tied into what sort of plan is submitted and how that plan is designed to really make a difference. I mean, again, these are concepts back from the 60s to protect the rights of most vulnerable children. And we're trying to find unique ways of providing flexibility that keeps the protection, the concentration of resources, and at the same time says to the building and the districts, if you have something innovative to do here, there may be ways to approach this.
And we have another question, Rich, about the July 1st, 2016 Title I recalculation date.
Okay. Yeah, that recalculation is related to when the money actually goes out, and the money goes out in Title I in roughly in two waves. One is July 1, the other one is October 1, and so that what you can see here is that it's how your child count is going, the poverty count is going, and how that's affected. But those actual allocation decisions are made in test runs in the spring at the U.S. Department of Education. They use the county-based data and translate that into school districts. And for those of you who are in school districts where counties are contiguous, it's not as difficult an issue on allocation. But those of you who are in places where there are, like in New Jersey, last time I checked this, there were 638 school districts and about 21 odd counties. So you can see how the poverty data is coming in based on county, and it has to be calculated based on school districts.
Great. Well, it doesn't look like there are any more questions at this time. Again, we encourage you to go ahead and follow up with us offline if you have any additional questions. Otherwise, we look forward to seeing you at our next webinar on Wednesday, April 27th from 3:30 to 4:30 p.m. Eastern Time that will be talking about Title II and professional development. Thank you very much and have a great day.